Boa noite a todos. Com muito prazer, eu dou início a essa rodada de 3 eventos internacionais patrocinados pela Shell. Muito obrigado à Shell, os representantes da Shell. Primeiro, para quem não me conhece, meu nome é Carlos Quintela, sou diretor da FGV Energia. Gostaria de apresentar os 2 palestrantes e o que vai fazer a contextualização. Bom, o primeiro que vai fazer a contextualização, eu acho que é conhecido de todo o setor, nosso querido ministro, ex-ministro Fernando Coelho Filho, em nome da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Gostaria de agradecer sua participação. Entendo perfeitamente que o tempo do senhor é muito escasso na condição de deputado federal e é bem complicado, e dedicar o tempo do senhor para uma hora aí de um evento, realmente, eu tenho certeza que é o carinho que o senhor tem para com a Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Mais uma vez, senhor Fernando, muito obrigado pelo seu tempo. E, não menos importante, nossos 2 palestrantes internacionais, Carlos Pascoal, meu muito obrigado, em nome da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, mais uma vez, senhor prestigiando aqui nossos eventos. E o Francisco Monaldi, também nosso parceiro na Rice University, meu muito obrigado pela sua participação. Fernanda Delgado será a nossa moderadora dos 3 seminários internacionais. Obrigado, Fernanda, pelo seu tempo também. Esse evento vão ser 3 eventos internacionais, como eu disse há pouco, todos patrocinados pela Shell. O primeiro é esse, que já estamos aqui iniciando. O segundo é com Amory Lobbins, é o diretor da Rock Mountain Institute, e que o André Araújo, presidente da Shell, fará a apresentação e a contextualização. E o terceiro é com Fatih Birol, diretor-geral da Agência Internacional de Energia, com abertura e contextualização do ministro Bento Albuquerque. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado. Não posso deixar de agradecer os mantenedores da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, em específico da FGV Energia, que é o CEPEL, Equinor, Furnas, Ipiranga, Norte Energia, PetroRio, Enel e Eletronuclear. Meu muito obrigado por apoiar as pesquisas da FGV Energia. Bom, vamos dar início. Passo as palavras para a Fernanda fazer só a abertura, início, e em seguida eu estarei aqui, vou fechar minha tela, mas vou estar aqui prestigiando a todos. Fernando, mais uma vez, muito obrigado. Francisco também, Carlos Pascoal também. Fernanda, por favor. Fernanda.
Se quiser, eu posso dar uma palavra enquanto Fernanda chega, Carlos?
Fernando, é a sua abertura, Fernando.
Eu tinha entendido que ela tinha lhe chamado.
Não,
Desculpa,
chamou você. Fernando, é a sua abertura.
Não, eu tinha passado para a Fernanda te passar, mas é mais rápido de te passar direto, Fernando. Muito obrigado.
Aí, tá vendo, Fernanda? Não errei, não. Mas
Eu
tudo
entendi,
bem, vamos
Fernando.
lá.
Era o A e o O. Desculpe aí a confusão. Fernando, com a palavra aí, nosso querido ministro, por favor.
Vamos lá. Pessoal, boa noite. Eu queria, primeiramente, parabenizar e agradecer a FGV pela iniciativa, né? Mais uma vez, desse debate de alto nível, esse webinar. Queria, em nome do professor Carlos Ivan, do meu amigo Carlos Quintela, agradecer o convite e a oportunidade, em nome dele, de Fernanda, de todo mundo. Cumprimentar de forma particular Francisco, Monaldi, cumprimentar de forma muito carinhosa Carlos Pascoal, que tem sido, enfim, um amigo aí que nós construímos nesses últimos anos e deu uma grande contribuição para, enfim, todo o movimento que nós iniciamos há alguns tempos atrás na indústria de óleo e gás do Brasil. Eu fui aqui provocado pela Fundação para poder fazer 4, 5 minutos aqui sobre os desafios e provocar, digamos assim, os nossos palestrantes sobre esse momento que a gente tem. Eu fiz aqui algumas anotações, vou colocar as informações e vou ficar também aguardando e vendo o debate. Mas eu acho que tudo, a partir agora desse ano de 2021, com a presidência do presidente Biden, né, e a pressão pela redução das emissões ela vai ser uma crescente. Eu acho que a cúpula, agora recentemente, já sinalizou um pouco nesse sentido, e isso mostra que o setor elétrico e o setor energético ele vai ter um papel fundamental nessa redução das emissões. E quanto mais pressão para isso, nós temos visto nos últimos anos que isso trouxe mais investimentos em inovação e em renováveis. E essa pressão em renováveis, eu vejo aí, abrindo um parênteses, uma grande oportunidade para o Brasil, trouxe também o gás como sendo a energia de transição, mais um parênteses, mais uma grande oportunidade também para o Brasil. E isso tem tudo a ver com a nova geopolítica da energia, que é o ambiente e que é o tema dessa conversa de hoje, porque como é que o crescimento das renováveis, ouvindo aí a experiência dos dois que têm uma visão de mundo mais clara, como essa pressão das renováveis vai desafiar os países produtores de óleo, produtores de petróleo, principalmente os países do Oriente Médio, que sempre tiveram nessa questão do abastecimento do óleo e gás uma preponderância muito forte. A gente já viu recentemente com o desafio do shale, né, americano, que foi, digamos assim, já um desafio grande para eles. Um ano atrás, pouco mais de um ano atrás, a gente chegou a ver preço de barril sendo comercializado a preço negativo. Então, como é que essa pressão pelas renováveis vai, enfim, afetar esses países, OPEP members, né, os membros aí da OPEP, e como essa pressão pelas renováveis ou por essa nova pegada de clean energy, de energia renovável, vai também impactar os países, por exemplo, que têm potenciais de mineração, como é o caso para a necessidade de produção de painéis, de baterias, e aí a gente está falando de lítio, de cobalto, de vários outros minerais que são importantes. Isso talvez a gente veja um deslocamento, digamos assim, dessa preponderância, que evidentemente continuará muito forte pelo valor que ainda se terá durante o tempo o petróleo, mas a gente podendo ver, talvez deslocando um pouco essa influência dos países do Oriente Médio, mais aí dividindo isso com China e os Estados Unidos. Então, como é que se dará essa nova geografia dessa influência desses países? E aí, também eu acho que vale sempre, puxando aqui, eu bato sempre nessa tecla, não é de hoje, Quintela, embaixador Carlos Pascoal e Francisco Monaldo. Eu acho que a gente muitas vezes fica aqui no debate, principalmente nós políticos, querendo achar de que o Brasil, que é um país que tem muitas riquezas, enfim, ele é disputado por todos. E é bem verdade que todos querem estar no Brasil, mas todos querem estar no Brasil enquanto as contas fizerem sentido. Ninguém vem investir no Brasil porque gosta do Brasil ou porque gosta de passear no Brasil. Tem que fazer sentido econômico. E a gente está vendo já montadoras, empresas e países já dando metas muito claras de zerar a sua pegada de carbono, as suas emissões, ou a sua produção fóssil, e a gente aqui ainda está discutindo como é que vai ser os modelos de leilão, como é que vai ficar para poder explorar mais ou explorar menos, porque aquilo é uma riqueza da nação. E eu bato nessa tecla, já não é de hoje, muitos aqui que tiveram a oportunidade de já me ouvir falar em outros ambientes, de que essa riqueza ela tem que ser usada em favor do Brasil agora, porque senão aquele velho discurso de parte da política de que o petróleo é nosso, se a gente não conseguir dar utilidade a ele agora, aí é que o petróleo vai ser nosso mesmo, porque ninguém vai querer mais o petróleo, não vai fazer mais sentido a gente poder tirar ele de 3, 4, 5, 6 quilômetros debaixo de sal, de água, de terra, porque a sua conta vai ser inviável economicamente. Então, eu acho que esses são os desafios puxados que a gente tem, mas, de novo, só o último parênteses, como eu já fiz no começo, mesmo tendo esse desafio na parte da exploração, eu acho que o Brasil é abençoado pela sua geologia. A gente tem no gás e nessa oferta abundante de renováveis aqui, tudo para poder, digamos assim, continuar sendo um país de vanguarda. Eu espero e trabalharemos sempre aqui, não só como brasileiro, mas para que a gente continue fazendo esses debates e colocando o país nesse espaço, mas é sempre muito enriquecedor e importante a gente estar ouvindo figuras aí como os nossos dois palestrantes de hoje, para que eles nos façam nos lembrar de que tem muito mais do que Brasil, tem muito mais do que Rio de Janeiro, Espírito Santo, Bahia e Bacia de Santos, tem todo um mundo que olha com atenção para o Brasil, mas eu não sei durante quanto tempo a gente vai conseguir, digamos assim, continuar sendo atrativo para esse tipo de indústria que a gente conhece hoje e que ela está mudando numa velocidade muito rápida. Então, mais uma vez, a parabenizar a Fundação. Eu queria, Carlos, agradecer a você aí a iniciativa e a oportunidade de estar revendo aí duas grandes figuras, e de forma particular o nosso Carlos Pascoal.
Obrigado, ministro Fernando. Passo a palavra agora para a Fernanda Delgado, moderadora desse painel. Por favor, Fernanda.
Obrigada, Carlos. Obrigada, ministro Fernando. Eu costumo sempre dizer que o Brasil é muito maior do que o pré-sal e que o Brasil é muito maior que a Petrobras. Eu acho que isso vai muito de encontro ao que o senhor acabou de falar. E agora eu vou mudar de língua para a gente poder acompanhar e trazer os nossos dois painelistas aqui. Hello, everyone. I'm Fernanda Delgado. I'm a professor and researcher from FGV Energia, and this is Energy in Focus from FGV Energia that bring important panelists to discuss. And today we are going to discuss geopolitics. This is just a very brief housekeeping for today. Everything that we are discussing today regards just our opinion, my opinion, Francisco Monaldi opinion, Carlos Pascal opinion, and not the opinion of FGV. Also, the transmission is going to be on the YouTube, and you can send us your questions from the YouTube. You have a little link over there, call it the Slido. Send us your questions. I will be delighted to make your questions to Francisco and to Carlos here. There are so many things going on the oil geopolitics today, on the geopolitics of energy today. Despite the ups and downs of the world energy industry itself, we have the pandemic, and we have the international energy crisis. And after all, we have this energy transition thing, this energy transition process that is coming toward us. Big oil investments remain primarily focused on oil and gas, but capital spending is ramping up dramatically. On this webinar on geopolitics, we will discuss what political and geographic circumstances affects the volatility of oil prices on international market, and also the significant increases in oil prices that has been driven since the end of the year, what the geopolitical aspects has been affecting the cold in the northern hemisphere, the tensions in the Middle East, as Mr. Fernando just said, which are responsible. There are other issues, of course, the OPEC and the OPEC plus strategies to keep the offer and to keep the offer hold, and how the demand has been responding of all this market structure. And for this today, I have the honor to have Mr. Carlos Pascual, Senior Vice President of Global Energy IHS Market. Carlos, thank you so much for your time today, for your generosity to be here with us today and to discuss with the Brazilian public. And I have Mr. Francisco Monaldi, Baker Institute Fellow and the Director of Latin America Energy Program. Thank you so much, Francisco, to be here with us today. In my name, in Carlos Quintela name, my director, and in FGV Energia name, I appreciate your time today. I will start with some questions while we wait for the questions from the public. And I will have a first question for Mr. Carlos Pascual. Carlos, in your opinion, in your view, how geopolitical aspects are really impacting offer and demand in the oil sector. Considering when we are considering OPEC cuts, Russia behavior, shale oil and gas production in the United States. How are those things really affecting oil prices? Carlos, once again, thank you. You're on mute.
Thank you, Fernanda. Fernanda, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you and the invitation. Carlos Quintela, thank you again for allowing me to be with you. Minister Coelho, always great wisdom listening to you. You have very, very smart observations and advice for all of us working in the energy sector. And my friend Francisco Monaldi, always a pleasure to be with him on a panel and to share ideas. The question, Fernanda, that you ask about the geopolitics of oil, geopolitics and oil prices and how they're affected. There's a short-term answer and there's a long-term answer. And both are really important and we need to pay attention to them. So let me touch a little bit on both, and both could require elaboration. The short-term answer, obviously very directly related to the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic. The United States has put in a $1.9 trillion recovery package, or huge acceleration of vaccinations, over 3 million a day. We're seeing a normalization of life slowly, not completely, but slowly it's beginning to happen. Demand is being restored. That's had a huge impact. Europe has fallen behind, but it's starting to recover. In Asia, we've seen a mixed picture, but generally demand has recovered. China has not had great success with its vaccination program, but it's managed to maintain control of the pandemic through electronic surveillance and controls on testing. And so the result is that there's an expectation that in the second and third quarters of this year, that we will see an increase of demand of 6 million barrels a day of oil. Now, what happens on the supply side becomes absolutely critical. And here, OPEC Plus, and especially Saudi Arabia, are at the center. Russia is a huge and major supplier already. It's not in a position to have a huge major expansion. OPEC has already indicated that it proposes to increase its supplies, OPEC Plus, I should say, by about 2 million barrels a day, a little bit more than that. But the most critical issue in the short term is going to be Saudi Arabia. No other country has the spare capacity to be able to respond quickly to the market. And so over the next few months, in the second and third quarters of this year, the story of what happens on price is going to be, how does Saudi Arabia in particular respond to this increase in demand? If they respond with a significant supply increase, as they've suggested that they're going to do, and restore the 1 million barrels a day that they have taken off of the market, we'll see prices potentially in the $70 range. If Saudi Arabia and OPEC don't respond strongly, we could see prices move up much higher into the $80 range. All right, what does that tell us? It also begins to show us that because in this market, where demand is relatively tight and declining, and I'll come back to that in the future, over the long term declining, what happens in supply is going to be the biggest factor affecting prices, and we're potentially going to see a significant amount of volatility in short cycles. A significant change from what we've seen previously in the market, where cycles might have lasted about a 10-year period of time. And it tells us two very simple things about the oil market. Number one, those who could produce the cheapest oil that have the lowest costs are going to protect themselves from that volatility. That's going to be absolutely essential. And secondly, if you have low carbon content in your oil, given what's happening, as Minister Coelho already indicated, more broadly with climate change, that's also going to be an advantage as well. So low price, low carbon content. There's a medium to long-term answer to your question that I just want to highlight, and we can go into it in much greater detail. We have seen over the past year a very unexpected development globally, even during the pandemic. Many people predicted that with the pandemic, that countries would simply slow down the pace of transition, of energy transition, and slow down their efforts to invest in addressing climate change. But instead, what we've seen is the opposite. About 130 countries in the world have now made commitments to net zero emissions by the year 2050, 2060 if you include China. Over 70% of the world's GDP is in those countries that have made net zero commitments. 73% of those emissions are in countries that have committed to net zero. What it starts to tell you, the United States, now with Joe Biden, China, the European Union, Japan, the UK, it's coming together in a way where there is an overwhelming wave that is generating this movement toward net zero. And yet, at the same time, what we also know is that only about 10 countries in the world have actually put in place legal frameworks to be able to achieve those targets. And 2021 is the year where we're starting to see this alignment between aspirations and climate action. The two of them need to be brought together. Hence, one of the reasons why the climate summit that we saw in the United States last week, an interest of the United States to do two things. One, to raise its hand and say, I'm back, I'm a leader. And two, we have to be much more serious and specific about the goals that we set, how we're going to achieve them. And one final thing I'll say here, the importance of action in the short term. And the reason for that is that over this next decade, we need to begin to take those actions that really bend that curve on emissions. Because if we can't start that curve moving down more sharply, then the cost of rejection between 2030 and 2050, if that curve looks like this, it becomes very expensive and very difficult to do. So interesting things that we have to see. Greater volatility in the oil markets, the need for lower costs, the prospects of long-term decline in demand in oil as there is greater emphasis that we're starting to see already on climate policy, on climate finance, and now on the actions and the public policy measures that are being taken in order to drive a more consistent and clearer agenda on emissions reduction.
Thank you, Carlos. Everything so interesting and all very imbricated as well, because when you talk about the offer and demand and the behavior of OPEC and OPEC Plus, we have to understand that this price is held in a non-natural way because the offer is controlled by the cuts. The demand is still not well responding. We don't know how the demand is going to respond from this all these packages of economic stimulus that has all over the world, especially in the United States. Joe Biden is signing with $2 trillion on renewables plus $1 trillion to get off the COVID, the pandemic thing. So there is a lot going on. And in the middle of that, you have the energy transition and the oil companies doing their homework on the energy transition. The thing is that we see the oil companies that are making their homeworks towards the energy transition are the international oil companies, but we are not seeing this movement from the national oil companies yet. So this is something that has to be addressed in a very short future, as very short future, as you said. We are in a hurry for this thing. Thank you so much. I will address a question to Francisco. Francisco, taking to our perspective here in Latin America, which countries in Latin America will benefit from the energy transition? Which ones are more exposed by the phasing out of fossil fuels? Which ones, in your perspective, are ready for this race to the top? Thank you, Francisco, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, for the invitation, and it's an honor to be with you and with Carlos Pascual in this conversation. As you say, this is a very interesting question, and Carlos framed for us the prospects of what might happen in the future. So he included the fact that we could have some price cycles in the short term and medium term. We could even have, periods of significant high prices, depending on how supply adjusts to the demand growth that we might have after COVID. But in the long term, or in the medium term, we can see within a decade, or we don't know the exact pace and timing of the decline of the peak of oil demand and eventually of the peak of natural gas demand, but we know that is going to happen. First oil, probably within this decade, and eventually natural gas, if we at all will fulfill the commitments that Carlos mentioned that countries have been making. But so in that context, Latin America faces some big challenges and some great opportunities. Latin America has the second largest endowment of hydrocarbons in the world after the Middle East. It depends a lot on how exactly you measure, but in the size of resources, there is no doubt that it's a massive endowment. And even though it's it's distributed in a very uneven way, there are countries with massive resources and others with very little. Without a doubt, the region faces the potential of leaving basically most of these resources on the ground as the energy transition accelerates. And that also, on the other hand, we have some significant potential to develop in a window of opportunity some of these resources. And as I mentioned, gas has a sort of a longer shelf life, so there might be some important opportunities in natural gas within the next 2-3 decades. It's unlikely that that renewables will be able to alone fulfill the increased demand for electricity that the region will face if there is economic growth in the next few years. Of course, there are countries that will be really impacted. Of course, Venezuela, that is in terrible shape but has massive oil reserves, is probably the country that is going to be in the long term more affected by the energy transition. It also has a very high carbon intensity in the Venezuelan oil reserves. You have other countries like Ecuador and Colombia that are still very dependent in terms of oil exports. In the case of Colombia, also adding coal. Of course, Colombia has limited resources and reserves, but still is a country that will have to deal with the eventual reduction in the oil revenues, in the oil rents, particularly because Colombia is a high-cost country. Then you have Mexico, which just around the corner. A few years ago, we all were thinking about the massive success of the Mexican energy reform in terms of attracting oil investment. But after President López Obrador put a lot of this in the freezer, and now with all the recent developments and the energy transition accelerating, it might be that Mexico has lost the opportunity to develop, for example, the massive potential in deep waters that Mexico has. Because companies, as it was mentioned by the minister, by Carlos, there are companies like BP or Shell that are starting to basically reduce their interest in and their commitment to invest in long cycle projects and greenfield projects, exploration, etc. So those countries that do not develop these resources relatively quickly would probably not develop them ever. Of course, depending on the costs, that might last longer. I mean, I think, for example, Brazil is well posed to take advantage of the window of opportunity. As the minister said, it's not necessarily a long window of opportunity, but the very high productivity of wells in deep waters in Brazil clearly offer a great opportunity. However, at some point, these long cycle projects will start to be hard to finance. Because of course, once the project is already developed, the costs are so low that they will continue. But to think about starting a new project when you start to think that assets might be stranded, I think will increasingly become a challenge. There are other countries, like Argentina, that had made a big bet on Vaca Muerta as a massive opportunity for growth. Vaca Muerta has the advantage of being a short cycle kind of investment that there is less risk of stranded assets because investments can be recovered quickly. But Argentina has been unable to create the conditions for the type of significant investment, for example, in LNG that are required to fulfill the massive potential. So I'm skeptical that they will develop the full potential of Vaca Muerta, although of course some of it will be developed, no doubt. You have, of course, Guyana, a country that from being the poorest or second poorest in the region will become the richest country in Latin America on a per capita basis. This is a country that will produce more oil per capita than Kuwait and the UAE. If the plans of Exxon are fulfilled, and so it will have a maybe short-lasted but tremendous creation of wealth in that country, and that will really tell us to other countries in the region on how to develop those resources at a fast pace. And finally, I wanted to mention some of the significant winners. There are countries that in the region that are big producers of minerals that are strategic for the energy transition, including, of course, copper, which Chile and Peru are major producers, and there are other producers, of course, in the region, and lithium, which has a massive reserves concentrated in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Unfortunately for Bolivia, I think they will not create the conditions for development of their lithium at the pace that it should happen. But Chile, without a doubt, will take advantage of both trends for electrification and batteries. They also, Chile is a country that until now was not blessed by energy potential, but now they also are blessed with the potential for solar and wind. So that's a clear winner. There, of course, the region has a massive hydro use in their energy matrix, but it's unlikely that will grow significantly in the next few years. But without a doubt, the countries that can harness the potential in terms of renewables are going to be much better poised to have success in this energy transition.
Thank you, Francisco. There is a lot going on in Latin America, and despite all that, we always have this sense that we have this desire for economic free of economic, to have a more liberal economic and have not so many democratic governments. That's so very Latin America. And you were talking about the movements that some oil companies did, like BP and Shell and others and Exxon. And one thing that we have to keep in mind is that those companies already did those movements in 2008, 2014, and they are doing those movements again towards the more renewable energy. So how to deal with that when you are in Latin America? Well, let me get back to Mr. Pascual. We were starting to talk about international and national oil companies. We are seeing many international companies making investments, but IOCs represent just 10% of the total of the oil and gas production in the world, and the other 90% are in hands of national oil companies. We just said that, but it seems to have the same, national oil companies seems not to have the same hush or the commitment to climate change. How to change that? Or better, how to achieve energy transition goals without national oil companies? Or what is the best to do to bring them in, how to bring them in, or how to achieve those goals without them?
Fernanda, thank you. I think it's surprising, but I think one of the things you'll find is that many national oil companies, and especially some of the national oil companies in the Middle East, are extremely excited about the energy transition and are taking massive steps in this direction. Let me give you the context of it, but let's step back for 1 second and just set the parameters. With the energy transition and the outlooks for the change in demand for future, depending on the scenario that you look at, the world is still going to be consuming in 2050 somewhere between 50 to 70 million barrels a day, right? Depending on which scenario you look at by which agency or which individual company. That's quite less than the 98 million barrels a day that we're projecting that we'll go back to by the end of the year, but still it's a significant amount. And so the first point to take out of that is that companies are asking the question, who is going to have the cheapest oil and who's going to have the oil with the lowest carbon content? Because they want to be the ones that sell that last barrel of oil under the 50 million barrels a day or the 70 million barrels a day or whatever it is. And what you're seeing out of many national oil companies, especially in the Middle East, is that I was in a discussion with somebody from Saudi Aramco and said, we have the lowest carbon content in the world. We're the cheapest producer in the world. We're totally prepared, moving ahead. But here's what's different. And so this is somebody from Saudi Aramco speaking. He's saying, we now are making massive investments in solar energy. In the most recent auctions that we had, the price of solar came in at $10 per megawatt hour, $10, 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Okay, phenomenal. And so what he said is, we're going to have the cheapest renewables. Because we have the cheapest renewables, we're going to be the cheapest producer of green hydrogen. And because we have natural gas, we're going to be the cheapest producer of blue hydrogen. And so the message from the senior executive from Saudi Aramco was energy transition, bring it on. Similar story with Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, right? Go through a similar kind of discussion. They've already set very aggressive targets for their transition. They've had auctions for solar power at $13 per megawatt hour. They have their oil standard, the Marban, has about half of the carbon content of other oil producers. Again, they're saying that they are absolutely poised to be able to move into this energy transition. And here's, I think, Fernanda, going to be one of the interesting things. Potentially what we may see in the future is a split in OPEC, because the interests of some of those countries are going to start to fundamentally deviate. The ones that do not have the capital and the resources to develop their renewable energy resources, to go through an energy diversification and transition, and to be able to adapt to a world of oil and renewable energy, those are the ones that are going to be left behind, and you're going to have others that are very ready to continue to move ahead.
Wonderful. So everything is not just about, it's not money or even the energy transition, it's about timing.
Well, it's about timing, but money is a big part of it because these companies are looking at it and they're saying, who's going to be the cheapest producer?
So they have it because they are cheap, so they are going to achieve it anyway. So the point is the timing and the phasing, how they are going to get the thing on in the word pace.
Well, pace is a critical factor, and I think for oil and gas producers, for Petrobras and every company that is trying to take advantage of developing the upstream in Brazil, the message is very clear. Anything and everything you can do to bring in techniques for cost reduction and efficiency, they have to be brought in now, and hence the importance of accelerating actions on digitalization and maximizing efficiencies in the upstream. And the same kind of message goes through on natural gas as well. But the other side of it is who has the potential to be able to benefit the most from their renewable resources and to be able to get the most out of them, including what are the mechanisms to be able to achieve the base load that's necessary to deal with the intermittency. And so when we ask the question Francisco was responding to, who can be the winners? Well, one of the countries that can be a winner certainly can be Brazil, with already 80% of carbon-free production in electricity, the ability to bring in gas to complement the reductions in hydro with climate, the ability to continue to invest in batteries and the use of biofuels. There's huge potential there for a reduction of emissions. And an asset that Brazil has that few countries have, nobody has in the same level, is the Amazon. And so here's one other factor which I think we need to bring into account. The world is going to need negative offsets. What do I mean by that? Negative generation of carbon. The reason is that there's still going to be carbon producers in the world. And they're going to be looking at where can they transfer resources to be able to buy down emissions reductions, right? So the Amazon Brazil provides, between the Amazon and agriculture, a huge opportunity to be able to do that. But in order to achieve it, one of the things that's going to be so critical is nailing down in the Paris negotiations what's called Article 6. Article 6 are the rules on accounting for carbon offsets. And so it may seem a little bit technical, a little bit boring, but it's really important. So, I want to be a good citizen. I get on an airplane, I buy carbon offsets, and I buy them to plant trees in Brazil, right? To offset it, right? So Brazil plants the trees and they're saying, okay, we're counting that as part of our emissions reductions. I'm a good citizen. I want to say, hey, I offset my emissions on traveling on an airplane, but we didn't get double the emissions. Only one of us gets to count them, right? So you need basic rules on how to do the carbon accounting. And for a country like Brazil, this is something that's potentially worth billions of dollars over the years, and where for Brazil, there's a huge opportunity now to engage in a very aggressive way in these climate negotiations to be able to create the foundation for yet greater capital resources coming back to the country. And rather than this issue of the Amazon and agriculture being one which has caused so much controversy internally within Brazil, it can be transformed into something which is a capital generator that's promoting sustainability, but is bringing in billions of dollars back into the country to be able to support the kind of sustainable development I think that most Brazilians want.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful to hear that. It gives us a hope that we have solutions. We have how to get away from all this trouble, to all this turmoil. And despite all that, I always like to say that Brazil has a good problem, that we have all the energetics here. We have oil, we have gas, we have wind, we have solar, we can do hydrogen from whatever. So we have the Amazon, we have all the kind of energy that we can do in the world you can find here in Brazil. Our problem in here is some kind of planning that we still don't have. We are still struggling, but as all Latin America countries. Thank you so much, Carlos. Getting back to Francisco, we are talking about decarbonization and Amazon. What do you think about the public policies for the energy transition in Latin America and the whole of the private sector in achieving competitiveness and sustainability in the region? Getting all this that Carlos just said, how can we think about public policies for this energy transition in Latin America?
Thank you. So yes, I think Carlos put something right in the center. I think it's really important, which is that the energy transition offers tremendous opportunity for countries such as Brazil and other countries in the region. And of course, Brazil, because of the combination of elements that we mentioned, it's in a really good position. And you know, it's really, I think it's really important. You see it here in the city of Houston, how you know, if you are a carbon emitter, you can think about how the energy transition will allow you to sort of, you know, make a business out of reducing your carbon emissions. Or as he mentioned, in the oil industry itself, there are massive opportunities for cost reduction to be competitive. The carbon offsetting is really important. But however, I am a little bit concerned that, you know, in the region, despite some countries making some important commitment in the past, policy and policy implementation in this area is lagging in most countries, and also in companies. And I am a little bit concerned about what we're seeing in the region politically, because, you know, COVID has been devastating for Latin America, not only in terms of deaths, but in terms of economic decline. I mean, it's probably the worst economic recession that we have had in the history of the region, probably going as back as the independence wars. So the consequences of that, if you think about what already had happened in the region with the decline of the commodity prices in the middle of last decade, we started to see a region in which political instability increased, in which moving away from a situation of popular presidents and you know, optimism about the region, we started to move into a situation in which incumbents became in general relatively unpopular. Presidents started to become not re-elected for the first time in the region, and there is a chance of a lot of you know, populist backlash and even, you know, basic instability and gridlock in policy. And because of these issues related to the economic situation in the region, you know, a region that already has, you know, significant inequality and the like, governments might unfortunately not look ahead about these massive opportunities and to take advantage of the crisis. I mean, countries in Latin America will not have the fiscal space that, for example, the US and the Biden administration has to sort of rebuild better, as they say, because simply, you know, they don't have that opportunity to finance these programs. But there are nevertheless a lot of opportunities for, you know, the recovery programs to have a priority in this area and take advantage of the interest of the multilaterals and the, you know, governments in the OECD countries to really seize those opportunities. But if politicians are pressured by populations that are dissatisfied, they might have, you know, shorter term objectives. They might see the climate policy as a burden on their short term rather than as a long-term opportunity. And so the challenges are significant. And we have a region, as you pointed out before, that it's dominated by national oil companies. Some of these national oil companies, like Petrobras and Ecopetrol, have done some important reforms and restructuring in the last few years in terms of, in the case of Petrobras selling assets, in the case of Ecopetrol buying an electricity distribution company and investing abroad. But the challenges are going to be big because oil rents are going to decline, and part of it you can offset by being more efficient, as Carlos said, but it's unlikely that you will have the same size of rents. And a lot of the oil companies in the region were founded because of, in order for the state to maximize the capture of those rents. But many of these companies, for example, Pemex being an obvious example, but also PDVSA or Petroecuador or Petroamazonas in Ecuador, are companies that are not efficient and will face significant and increasing difficulties. And it's not clear what they should do, because think about this, outside of the oil sector, state-owned enterprises don't have the role that they have in the oil sector. And that's basically because of the size of the rents in the oil sector allows the state to have these massive enterprises. But once those disappear, the question is, should Pemex, for example, become a more diversified company, go into renewables? It's not clear that they will be effective there, right? And similarly, others, Ecopetrol seems to be making a little bit of a bet in that regard. But of course, they have very limited reserves, and they have to be, move faster than other companies. And so, in the meantime, what should be the states in the region be? Should they be investing in assets that could be potentially stranded, or should they open to foreign investment more aggressively and let the private sector be the one that takes this long-term risk of a stranded asset? So these are the difficult questions, I think, that governments in the regions and national companies in the regions have to face. But going back to Carlos' point, the opportunities are there. The challenges are, I think, also tremendous. But there are countries that, fortunately, are fortunate, like Brazil, to have a mix of energy potentials and potentials for doing business with the offsets that really should not consider this as a threat as other countries that are mostly dependent on hydrocarbon production.
Great, thank you, Francisco. There is one thing very, very particular in Latin America that you said, that we are dominated by national oil companies. And one thing is that the monopoly of those national oil companies were very good once they were settled on the economy. And the governments should be proud when the economy does not need that monopoly anymore. It's something that you see, that the economic is so plural, is so diversified, that the monopoly is not needed anymore, and the economic can bring more agents and more companies. So there is no place more for the monopoly. It should be something to be celebrated by the governments and not to be bad seen by the governments, as we see in Latin America countries. Thank you, Francisco. Carlos, I have a question from Clarissa Lins here for you. Clarissa, she's congratulations for FGV Energia. And my question is to Carlos. To what extent President Biden's new approach to climate policies will shape the future of industry?
I think Clarissa puts her finger on something which is extremely important, because what President Biden is focused on is that we're not just talking about energy transition. We're not just talking about climate change. We're actually building a new global economic system with the industries behind it that are necessary to succeed in the 21st century. When you look at the American Jobs Plan that he's put forward, it's not just about traditional aspects of the infrastructure, but it goes deeply into the way that we produce goods, the energy that we use to produce them, but also even the kinds of things that we're producing in order to be able to have a more sustainable economy. If we think about steel, the importance that is placed, for example, on programs, pilot programs that could produce new alternatives to steel that could be used, for example, in automobiles, plastics that could be used that have lower emissions to them. The supply chains that are being produced, that are being developed, how they're developed in a way that address, as earlier was talked about, I think Minister Coelho talked about, addressed in a way that take into account the kinds of minerals that are being used, cobalt, lithium, nickel, copper, and how do you address those vulnerabilities? And if we think about one of the things that President Biden ordered was, in one of his first executive orders, was a national security strategy on supply chains. Never before has one ever heard of a president of the United States thinking of supply chains as a national security issue. And so my point here is that what we're seeing inherent in President Biden's approach is not just something which is linked to energy. It's linked to the kind of economy that you need to have, the economic systems, how energy is intertwined with it. But more fundamentally, what kind of economic transformation do we need to have in terms of the goods we produce, the way we produce those goods, the supply chains that are involved in them to achieve sustainability for the future? And I think that is going to be one of the biggest challenges that we all face. Can we understand and act on the magnitude of what's in front of us?
Thank you, Carlos. I'll get back to Francisco. Francisco, we were talking about energy transition and how President Biden is going to be this new energy economic, and we talked about Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Argentina, Guyana. How do you picture Brazil on all this when we are talking about the attraction of investments, as to say, when we are talking about Brazil is well positioned, as Mr. Pascual said, for the energy and for the emission reductions that we have a very good potential. But when we are talking about the attraction of investments, how do you position Brazil on our strategy here on Latin America?
Well, I think, I mean, first, it is striking, as Carlos said, there is this dramatic change that we are seeing in the world, a combination of, of COVID and its effects, and the move in the US from an administration that was a climate skeptic, and that, to give you an idea, I mean, Carlos was the creator of the Energy Bureau in the State Department, and in the Trump administration, they basically, most of their work was like promoting, for example, the shale development in Argentina, or things related to the hydrocarbon sector. And of course, you now have a president who appointed John Kerry as an envoy on climate, and it gave him a cabinet position, and all this massive movement in terms of commitments. Of course, the issue is that there is no bipartisan commitment in this area, and therefore it could happen that if there is a change in administration 4 years from now, the US does not continue with the same impetus. But going back to the case of Brazil, so Brazil, I think there are a few things that Brazil has to sort of keep in mind. I mean, first, we mentioned the fact that we have a window of opportunity to develop the oil and the gas resources. But let's start with oil. Brazil needs to move fast to develop their oil resources, and they had to work hard on improving or reducing costs, on being very efficient, and on reducing as much as possible the carbon content of energy production in Brazil. And that also might, I think, mean at some point trying to, as I said, diversify the risk of the country in terms of opening it more to foreign investment than it currently is. After all, Petrobras is very dominant in oil production. Then you have the development of the natural gas, that a significant part of it is associated with the oil in offshore in Brazil, and the conditions have to be created to take advantage of this. You have this massive hydro base load in the country, but you will need to incorporate natural gas in the future to compensate for the intermittency of renewables. You also have this very interesting combination of elements like the fact that you can have the carbon offsets, but you also have you have biofuels, you have hydro. Brazil has the flexibility that not many countries have in the region to basically, as the energy transition moves, take advantage of these different sources of energy. As I mentioned, other countries in the region are much more dependent on one or two fuels. There are countries like Chile that I think will benefit tremendously from the energy transition, but I think many others will actually have a difficult time adjusting to it. Not so, I think, Brazil, if the policies are right. But in the meantime, there's going to be, tensions, because there are always winners and losers. There is also going to be a shift with the type of companies that come to Brazil, and there might be smaller players coming into the smaller, higher cost fields to take advantage in the short term of those opportunities, while as I said, in the longer term, you will not have the big European companies, for example, in greenfield projects in oil. So there will be sort of a shifting of how players and which investment happen in the country.
Thank you, Francisco. I always like to say that the energy transition is a process, and there is no solution like one size fits to all. Each country has to make this whole own process that can make that can suit its expertises, and also that can fill in the pocket of their population. So electric vehicles are very expensive for the Brazilian population. So right now, this is not a very good solution for us in terms of energy transition. So we have biofuels. So it's not because it's good for the north of Europe, it's going to be good for a country like Brazil. So every country has to make their own energy transition regarding the society. So it's a social process. In the end of the day, it's an economic and social process also. Instead, Carlos, how Biden plans for economic recovery can change the plans for Latin America energy transition? How do you see this change of the new administration and this position of energy transition in Latin America? What could change for us here?
I think, Fernanda, and I'll be very brief because I'm conscious of the time that we've already gone over our allotted time. For the first time, you have a president of the United States who, number one, has made climate change one of the top 4 priorities of his administration. And secondly, he has incorporated climate change in every single aspect of his national security and foreign policy strategy. And so in looking at Latin America, I think one of the things that you're going to see from this administration is an increased integration of questions that are related to security, energy, and transition together that are going to inform the way that the Biden administration is going to respond to the region. I can tell you one very immediate issue, which doesn't fall within the parameters of energy, but it certainly does on climate change when you look at the broader implications. And it has to do with the devastation we've seen in Central America and migration coming to the United States. One of the fundamental factors has been the impact of climate change, particularly on Guatemala and Honduras, and the impact it's had on the flow of people. And this administration is looking at that squarely in the eye and is saying, if we're going to address these issues of migration coming to the United States, we have to recognize that climate change is a global problem, it's a security problem, and we need to invest in the communities that are being affected by this and address some of those concerns. I think you're going to see from the Biden administration a renewed emphasis on interconnections across countries, because if you have those interconnections, you have greater flexibility and efficiencies and where to invest in renewable energy, and you have greater capacity through the interconnections to reduce some of the vulnerabilities that are caused, for example, because of the brownouts that result from the impacts of climate change on the reduction of hydro energy, if you have an opportunity to interconnect within states. And so I think you're going to see an administration asking those kinds of questions, seeking to find ways to promote constructive investments in energy transformation and transition, being willing to use mechanisms for offsets in nature-based solutions, and finally, a greater willingness to use the resources of financing and risk reductions to support investments throughout the region on renewable energy, on batteries, on sharing of technology that are going to be critical to the transformation and accelerating the transformation of the region.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Actually, we got the end to our webinar. We are here for more than an hour. I would like you to make your final considerations, and thank you so much for being here. Francisco, for your final words, please.
Well, no, I think I am very pleased to have been part of this panel. I think it is clear that we are facing big uncertainties in terms of time and pace of the transition, but we have the certainty that the transition is ongoing, and so the region cannot fall into looking at the short-term crisis that we are facing in terms of the economy and the politics, without keeping an eye towards this really important challenge, the challenge of our generations in the world, and the countries that really take advantage and take the bull by the horns and really move in this direction will be much better poised to move into this new world, and those who because of their political difficulties, instability, and the like, do not create new policy frameworks and advance on this arena will face significant challenges, including the challenges that, as Carlos mentioned, will come because of climate change itself. That is going to be a big challenge for countries in our region. So tremendous opportunities, but really difficult challenges, and in the end, policy in this space is absolutely essential. This cannot be only solved by the private sector. It requires political commitments and political consensus.
Sure. Thank you so much, Francisco, for joining us here. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Mr. Pascual, your last words, please, your final considerations.
Fernanda, I think what's, to use an analogy, when one sees a great wave coming before them, one has an opportunity to think about how to respond to that. One could stand in the same place and allow that wave to crash on you, and it will over time wear those rocks away. The other opportunity is to look at the force and the power that that has, and to be able to see that it's an opportunity and to get on it and understand how to write it and take it into the future. And it goes back to the points that Minister Coelho started us off with. We need to be thinking about the future. What can that future look like? How can those opportunities be created? How can we move in ways that allow us to understand that this wave that is before us is defining a new reality where its sustainability is fundamental to our success as a planet, but it also to the very success of all of the companies that we understand and know are and are engaged with as well. And so if we can achieve that fundamental change of looking at changing the mindset so that we are looking at these issues of transition, climate change, transformation as an opportunity to do something which is giving the next generation an opportunity for a greater livelihood, and is using the current generation as a way to create the jobs that allow us to get there. It's not going to be simple. I don't want to be simplistic, but if we can't start to make that transformation, that political transformation in our outlook, we can't succeed. But if we can make that political transformation, then the potential for success of what we are giving our own generation and future generations is something that will be with us forever and will be a treasure and a prize that we have to hang on to. And that needs to be our inspiration.
Thank you, Mr. Pascual. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I really appreciate it. I pass the word to Carlos. Carlos, por favor.
Boa noite a todos. Eu não poderia deixar de agradecer ao Carlos Pascual, ao Francisco, e vou em seguida passar a palavra para o nosso querido ministro Fernando Coelho fazer as considerações finais. Mas antes que eu passe a palavra, se eu passar a palavra para o Fernando, todo mundo depois vai embora, que só estão aqui esperando o Fernando falar. Não é para mim, não, Fernando. Um monte de gente aqui falando, deixa eu tietar o Fernando, nosso melhor ministro. Bom, eu queria agradecer muito a presença, principalmente dos nossos mantenedores, a participação, e o patrocínio da Shell, com a presença do seu presidente André Araújo e do seu vice-presidente Flávio Rodrigues. Muito obrigado por vocês estarem aqui e apoiarem esses 3 webinários internacionais que a FGV Energia está fazendo. André e Flávio, em nome da Shell, em nome da FGV Energia, queria muito agradecer a Shell. Queria só colocar, me perdoem, eu vou esquecer alguns nomes, posso deixar passar batido, mas queria só formalizar a presença de pessoas que eu passando aqui rapidamente, vi. O presidente da BR, senhor Wilson Ferreira, obrigado por prestigiar e sua participação aqui direta, mas obrigado, senhor Wilson Ferreira. Milton Rangel, representante, vice-presidente de finanças da PetroRio, nosso querido amigo e embaixador Roberto Ardegui, diretor da Petrobras, também está aqui presente nos bastidores, nossa conselheira consultiva Ieda Gomes e Davi Zimmerstein, ambos ícones do setor de gás e setor de petróleo, Paulo Pedrosa, Patrícia Pradal, da Chevron, Eduardo Guerra, presidente da PPSA, obrigado, Eduardo, e os nossos amigos, não menos importantes, por último, da IHS, Bedregal e Rodrigo, obrigado por apoiar também e trazer nosso guru, Carlos Pascual. Agora sim, eu estou tranquilo para terminar, porque eu passo a palavra para o Fernando e todo mundo em seguida pode ir embora, que só estava esperando o Fernando falar. Nosso amigo Fernando, por favor, as suas considerações finais. E mais uma vez, Pascual, muito obrigado. Francisco, muito obrigado. E Fernanda, você, como sempre, foi excelente. Obrigado. Fernando, por favor.
I don't have Fernanda English to do the closing, so I'll close in Portuguese. Mas, Quintela, mais uma vez, parabéns a você e a FGV Energia, a Fernanda, pela brilhante mediação e, de forma muito particular, a Francisco e a Carlos por dar a gente essa visão e aí que a gente está, enfim, teve a oportunidade aqui, mesmo que rapidamente, mas é sempre importante da gente poder estar atento, e vocês têm a oportunidade de estar conversando com outros policymakers aí mundo afora, e a gente aqui no Brasil precisa desses insights e desse conhecimento aí de vocês. Cumprimentar também, assim como Quintela já fez, diversos amigos e pessoas aí que eu admiro do mundo da energia, brasileiros aí fantásticos que estão também aqui hoje acompanhando esse debate, essa palestra que a gente teve a chance. Espero que vocês estejam todos bem. Vamos nos encontrar nos próximos encontros aí da GV. Se cuidem, vamos nos prevenir para que a gente possa virar logo de uma vez por todas, se Deus quiser, essa pandemia, e possamos nos reencontrar com muita saúde, discutindo o nosso setor elétrico e energético aí, ainda com mais ênfase. Então, parabéns FDV, parabéns Fernanda, obrigado Carlos e obrigado Francisco aí também pela participação. Um grande abraço a todos.